my first.
And I'm the Executive Director of the Education Writers Association. And welcome to the Thomas B. Fordham Institute's event on grade inflation. What happens when report cards lie? So welcome to those of you who are here in person and to those of you who are joining us for the live stream. If you want, anything you hear is on the record. So if you want to tweet about it, just use the hashtag grade inflation, right? So yeah, it's a great topic. I hope it's kind of refreshing. We've all been just sort of immersed in politics all week, and this kind of lets us step out of that a little bit. I think when we hear about grade inflation, we tend to think about it in terms of higher education often. We hear that colleges and universities, for example, it's easy, professors are handing out A's a lot more than they used to, say, especially at elite schools. And I think grade inflation at the K-12 level has gotten a little bit less attention. And even if it is noticed at the K-12 level, it's often discussed in the context of college admissions. For example, the test optional policies that we're seeing adopted, and the question about, well, if there is grade inflation and you don't have standardized test scores, what does that mean for college admissions and, sending signals to higher education? So, but, there are many reasons to think about grade inflation at the K-12 level beyond its relationship to higher education. And that's what I think we're going to be talking about today. So, let's get clear, though, about what we mean by grade inflation. We've got some great researchers here, and when researchers think about grade inflation, they kind of break it up into three different buckets. One bucket is just static grade inflation, and that simply means that grades and test scores are not aligned. There's a conflict between them. They're sending different messages. For example, kids who get A's and B's flunk their standardized end of course exam, or they have high GPAs and they do poorly on the SAT or the ACT. So that's sort of just the conflict. That's the static differential, the static grade inflation. Then there's dynamic, and that, of course, talks about change over time, the degree to which the relationship between the grades and the test scores is changing, like, say, over a 10-year period. It's narrowing or it's widening. And then finally, differential grade inflation, and that's sort of the difference. Is the relationship between grades and test scores different in different kinds of schools? For example, wealthier schools, do we see a smaller or larger gap than higher poverty schools? So with that, in the way of introduction, I want to say there are three recent publications that are really informing our conversation today. And the first is a book published this year by Johns Hopkins Press. It's called Measuring Success, Testing Grades and the Future of College Admissions. And a researcher who contributed a chapter to that volume is here, and that's Michael Hurwitz. He's a senior director, is that right?
Yep.
Senior director at the College Board. Also, we another recent publication was the TNTP report that came out at the end of September called The Opportunity Myth: What Students Can Show Us About How School is Letting Them Down and How to Fix It. The lead partner on the project for TNTP was Bailey Cato Zubrick, and she is joining us as well, and we'll talk about that very high-profile report. And then finally, last but definitely not least, the Fordham Institute with their own study. It was released in September as well, Grade Inflation in High Schools, 2005 to 2016. And Adam Tyner, Associate Research Director here at Fordham, is going to talk about that study and share the findings with us. So just what we're going to try to accomplish today, we're going to look at the what, the why, and the how. We're going to try to look at what are the trends in grades and their relationship to test scores. Then why are we seeing the trends play out? And then how do we try to solve the challenges that this research has presented? So with that as our objective, Adam, why don't you kind of walk through the findings of the recent Fordham study?
Sure, thanks, Caroline.
Yeah.
So Fordham released this study in September. It's just entitled Grade Inflation during this period from 2015 to 2016. From 2005 to 2016, Grade Inflation in High Schools. It was conducted by Seth Gershenson of American University in collaboration with Fordham. And it uses, and you can go to the first slide if you got that. It uses data from North Carolina during that period, focusing on Algebra 1. North Carolina, am I controlling that? Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. So it's, we focus on Algebra 1 because in North Carolina there are end of course exams, EOCs, for algebra for all students. So for Algebra 1, we have a grade that they received in the class and also their EOC score that we can kind of compare to see how they're changing over time and then how students' grades match up to those EOC scores and the different performance levels on it. We also look at cumulative GPA and ACT scores some, and we're basically answering the question, how well aligned are grades and exam scores, and how does alignment between those vary over time and between schools over time. So the first thing that we might take away from this study is that grades can be misleading. The figure that you can see here has the percentage of students on the y-axis along the side is the percentage of students. So this is each group of bars is a group of students with a particular grade level. So with a particular grade in the course. So A students, B students, C students, and then D and F students in Algebra 1. And then each of those bars in each group is the percentage of students who scored at a particular level on the EOC. So you'll see that for A students, the students who did best grade-wise in the class, 92% of those students were getting at least the sufficient level. That's the far right bar of the three there. 92% of students were getting that. The solid and above level, or the solid level, is aligned with college and career readiness. So you can see that the majority of A students meet that benchmark, but still about a fifth of students don't meet the college or career level, or career ready level. And for the superior level, the really mastery level, only about a fifth of A students meet that high bar. For B students, it's much more of a mixed bag. You can see that a majority, if you look at the middle bar for the B students, that's the college and career ready standard. Just 43% of B students are meeting that, meaning that a majority of B students don't meet the college and career ready standard, and more than a third of them don't even meet the simple proficiency standard. Another thing that we noticed is that grades are rising. Median cumulative GPAs have increased during this study, and this here is broken out, is broken out between students who attend more and less affluent schools. So the x-axis here is over time, and the y-axis is the GPA, the median cumulative GPA, and you'll see that it rises for both groups during this period, this 11-year period, and then it rises a bit more for the students in the more affluent schools. And so the gap between average GPA in North Carolina actually grows during this period. But test scores are rising too, and so of course we're looking at grades conditional on test scores. And since test scores are rising too, what Seth did was to look at the extent to which grades are rising when we compare them to test scores, starting with the baseline year of 2005. So compared to how it was in 2005, is it getting easier or harder, in this case, to receive an A? So the x-axis here, or sorry, the y-axis here is the change in the likelihood of receiving an A relative to how it was in 2005. And then the orange bar is for more affluent schools, and the teal bar, or the blue bar, is for less affluent schools. And you can see that in the first few years, it seems to change just a tiny bit, where it's a little bit harder to get an A given your EOC score. But after that, for the students in the more affluent schools, it gets easier. In all of those years, it's above 0. And for the students in the less affluent schools, it's either around 0 or it's actually getting harder to get an A for students with the same test scores. So grade inflation, if to the extent that it exists, is more concentrated in the more affluent schools. Grade inflation over that 11-year period. A couple takeaways are just that earning a good grade is not a guarantee that the student has learned what the state expects. We've got half of B students in algebra who aren't meeting the college and career ready standard, and a third of them are failing the EOC completely. These are B students. These are students who are taking home a pretty good grade on their report card and aren't able to demonstrate that more than a third of them can't demonstrate even the simple proficiency. And another thing that we took away from this study is just the importance of some of these test scores, that they can help us to make these comparisons that we wouldn't be able to make otherwise. And while they're not perfect, grades aren't perfect either. They're really complementary. And so we definitely want to look at students in a more holistic way so that we can get all that information.
Well, thanks. So following up on this, Adam, how about Mike, you want to talk a little bit about the research you did that contributed to your chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few things that I'd just like to say first. I know Seth is not here, but I'd like to compliment him and just, give props to the Fordham Institute, because this is such an exceptional study, and the amount of work that went into, you should all read the study, but the amount of work that went into producing this study, taking transcript data, student transcript data from an entire state over a more than 10-year period, it's really an impressive effort. And so I think,
just interrupt and ask a question about that.
Sure.
I just wanted to clarify for everyone. Not how many years, but how many grade levels, when you talked about the cumulative GPA going up like that, was that?
So so you're right. There were two different things. We're mostly talking about algebra, but the cumulative GPA was one place we weren't talking just about algebra. We were talking about students' full cumulative GPA for all of high school.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to clarify that.
So that is what the study that I did with Jason Lee, who's now at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, was about. And I think the question broadly about this study is, how representative are the findings from North Carolina? And the answer is they're very representative. There is now sort of a confluence of studies that demonstrate the exact same phenomena. High school grades are increasing, and they are increasing more rapidly at wealthy schools. There was a study put out several years ago by the U.S. Department of Education that used very good data from the high school transcript survey that actually even took a longer time frame, went back to 1990, and showed between about 1990 and 2009, average high school GPAs of graduates increased by 0.32 GPA points. It's a very sharp increase, and over that time, there wasn't any increase in NAEP scores, right? So as high school GPAs were increasing, there wasn't any demonstrated increase in the standardized metrics against which grades can be calibrated.
That's almost 20 years, is that right?
It's
You're
almost
saying
20
90
years,
to-
1990 to 2009. What we did in our study that looked at, we collect high school GPA data from SAT test takers. So our comparative advantage is that we have an enormous data set for each year, much larger than what you'd get from any individual state and much larger than what you'd get from a Department of Education sort of survey. What we found is that high school GPA has really been increasing quite steadily and at really a steady clip since about 1998. But what we see is that a lot of that growth is driven by the wealthier public schools and private high schools. And again, these trends can't be explained entirely by changes in SAT scores. And so the North Carolina study, awesome study, looks at public schools, right? So it's only public schools. The data come from the North Carolina Department of Education. What we find is that when we look at our College Board data of SAT test takers, way back in the halcyon days of the late 1990s, students from private high schools and students from public high schools had the same high school GPAs, about 3.25, again, among SAT test takers. Currently, we've seen that the high school GPAs of public school SAT test takers increased to about 3.35. By contrast, private schools are now above 3.5 in terms of average high school GPA. So we see this interesting gradient in grade inflation, differential grade inflation, by high school affluence within public schools. But we also see that when we look across school types. And so, another interesting thing that happened in North Carolina, I don't mean to call out North Carolina too much, but at the same time that grades, high school GPAs in North Carolina have been increasing, high school graduation rates have been skyrocketing. So just a statistic right here, in the 2005-2006 cohort, students who should be graduating from high school in the 2005-06 cohort, in North Carolina, the graduation rate was 68.3%. By 2017-2018, that had increased to 86.3%. So the increase in graduation rates, I think this is an excellent thing. It's great. But our excitement about it might be tempered if what we're discovering is that the students who are graduating are not college or career ready. In other words, if students are just sort of getting ushered through, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about that locally right here in Washington, D.C. But there, over the past, as you said, a lot of the discussion on grade inflation has really been focused at the college level. And some of that might be due to the fact that, you have a lot of researchers who work at colleges and maybe the data are just sort of easier to collect and aggregate. At the college level, there has not been a whole lot in the literature. There have been some studies, but there hasn't been much attention. But over the past year, I've noticed there have been some very interesting local stories that have started to pop about grade inflation. And one, again, another local story in Montgomery County, right here. A couple of years ago, Montgomery County abolished final exams. And since they discontinued final exams, and this is just over like 4 or 5 years, the number of A's doubled, right? So just taking away the final exam resulted in this drastic increase, a really sharp increase in grade inflation, much sharper than I think what you guys have seen in your data or what I've seen in my data. And there have been some other interesting stories. One in the Maine, is it the Portland Herald?
Yeah.
They managed to work with some local public schools and they got the high school GPA data. And they also show that locally in Maine, we're seeing over the past, 5-6 years, steady increase in high school GPAs. So I think that moving forward, it would be great if more of sort of these local stories, local folks could sort of take over, because the thing with grade inflation is it's not occurring everywhere. It's not like every single school in the country is experiencing it. It's that some schools are experiencing it. I think some schools are doing a very good job of fighting it. But what that means is it's so much harder to interpret what an A grade means, right? If some schools are resisting the urges to assign higher grades and others are succumbing to these temptations. The last thing that I want to mention, which isn't so much about grade inflation, but it's about another interesting thing about high school grades, and that is class rank. What we're seeing now is that class rank is disappearing at a very rapid clip, right? And so what that means is it's much harder to interpret what an A means, right? So if you have a student with a 3.8 GPA and they're ranked first in their class of 300, to me that suggests that you're dealing with a school that probably has a rigorous grading rubric. But if you don't have any sort of class rank metric, and you as a college aren't getting tons and tons of applications from a given high school, it's very difficult to contextualize what that means. And actually, over the past 12, 13 years, if you look at colleges in the most competitive Barron's category, at the typical college in that category, the fraction of students entering with class rank decreased by, get this, 20 percentage points. And, I talked about how grade inflation, it kind of differs across schools. If you go to universities and you just look at their common data sets, many universities, their offices of institutional research have common data sets, and the universities all report out the fraction of first-year students with class rank. You can actually drill down at the college level, and it's just amazing the consistency, particularly at the top colleges, and how this is just a uniform decrease.
It seems like there might be, but the high schools might have an incentive to, have the vanishing valedictorian because they want to increase the chances of their kids maybe getting in, and colleges might have an incentive to do away with it so they don't have to report to, those who do rankings, certain magazines that do rankings. Because a lot of that can affect how you rank. And if you don't have rankings, then maybe kind of masks those differences.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks for that. And Bailey, do you want to share some kind of highlights around, the opportunity that there was a lot you guys looked at, but maybe kind of the findings more focused on the issue of grade inflation?
So we, as Carolyn said, the opportunity myth was a broad overarching study that attempted to kind of dig into the phenomenon that Mike mentioned. We nationally have seen high school graduation rates going up and up and up, and we've also seen enrollment in remedial courses once you get to college going up. And so we wanted to answer the question at a high level: how is it that so many kids come out of the American public education system unready to meet the goals they have for themselves and unready to be successful in college? And so we want to anchor the conversation about the signals grades send to kids and their families, and the idea that in our study we partnered with 5 districts, 3 urban, 1 rural, and 1 national CMO, and we started by actually surveying students in 3rd to 12th grade and asking them a set of baseline questions about just what is it you aspire to? What are your educational aspirations? What do you want to be when you grow up? And we heard from over 94% of the kids in our sample that they aspire to college, and we also saw that by the time kids got to high school, they actually had educational aspirations that would require that they get a 4-year, or job aspirations that would require that they get a 4-year college degree. And so we wanted to dig into the signals kids are sending grades are sending to kids and their families, because we heard loud and clear from the kids themselves that they aspired to college. And pretty overwhelmingly what we saw in the 5 districts where we were partnering is that signals, much like what both of y'all found, the signals kids and families are getting from their grades actually don't tell them all that much about how well they are prepared academically for the rigors of standardized assessments. You can see similar to what we saw in North Carolina, we saw 3rd to 8th graders who were getting B's in their ELA and math courses. 65% of them do not demonstrate proficiency on the state assessment. We actually saw that even more starkly in AP exams, where 80% of the kids who got B's in our districts did not make a 3 or higher on their AP exam. And so we We were positioning this from the position of what signals are families getting from grades, knowing that grades are actually the most consistent messages parents get about how their kids are doing. They're also probably the most consistent messages kids themselves get about how they're doing in school. We also then asked ourselves, do different kids actually get a different quality of signal? And here we were looking at static grade inflation, which I feel like is important to call out here. What we saw though is that the signaling power of grades, at least in our 5 districts, actually differed by race for kids. So kids of color and parents of color are actually getting much less accurate signals about how well prepared their kids are to be successful on standardized assessments than white parents are, to the point where in our districts, if I'm a kid of color who gets an A in an AP class, I'm as likely to pass the AP test as a white kid who gets a C. And when we thought about the signaling power there, parents and kids don't know that. They don't know that their grades can mean different things depending on the school they go to or the teacher that gives them their grade. And so we, as you said, our study was certainly broader than thinking about the messages that grades send to parents and their families. But when we asked ourselves, why do we see that disconnect? A part of our study was actually trying to deeply study a subset of classrooms in our partner districts for 3 weeks. So my team spent 3 weeks on the ground, and part of what we did was collect every assignment that kids worked on for 3 weeks. And when we think about why is it that the grades are inflated in our districts, we have the start of what for us is a hypothesis. So we collected 5,000 assignments, 25,000 pieces of student work from these 5 districts, and then we graded each of them twice. You can imagine my team of graders loved me, because I was like, we're going to not grade them once, guys, we're going to grade them twice. The first time we graded them, we asked ourselves simply, did the student successfully do what the assignment asked? Did the kid make at least an 80, make at least an A or a B? And 71% of the time, the answer to that question was yes. Kids are successfully doing what it is that their assignments ask them to do. But then we graded assignments again. And we asked ourselves the question, did the student successfully demonstrate the demands of a grade level standard? This is a 3rd grader and a math assignment. Did this kid do something that demonstrates that they can do 3rd grade level math? The answer to that question was only yes, 17% of the time. That is a 50 percentage point gap. 54 percentage point gap that is full of assignments that kids are doing really well on. They're getting A's and B's, where they're not demonstrating the demands of grade level standards, not because they can't do it, but because they didn't even get a chance to do it, because we're giving them consistently below grade level work. It tied back, I think, to the introduction of you all's study, where Aileen Moskowitz had a quote of, do teachers, do leaders know what excellence looks like? Do they know what demonstrating grade level content actually is? And in our case, we said we're pretty consistently seeing that the answer is no, but we're telling kids and families with their grades that they're on track to reach the goals they have for themselves.
Well, I think that's just fascinating, and it does sort of suggest part of the answer potentially to the question of why you might be seeing a disconnect between the grades and the test scores if the tests are measuring grade level standards, but the kids are not having the opportunity to do grade level work, yet they're being graded on work that is subgrade level, but they're succeeding on it. So that's sort of very kind of a provocative finding, getting to the why. So yeah, thank you all for these reflections. And I think it seems to me that there is pretty much a consensus that we are seeing grade inflation at the K-12 level. But I'm not sure that everybody thinks it's a problem. I just think that you could think, well, we're in this era of rising standards, right? We're kind of in the post Common Core and Common Core like change to higher standards. And, to play devil's advocate a little bit, don't we want kids to be learning more, and if they're learning more of the materials, shouldn't their grades be going up, right? So, I mean, maybe some people would think that's not necessarily a problem, and maybe they shouldn't really care if the GPAs are going up. But, I think when we look at the trends and the disconnects, another thing people might say is, well, kids don't test well, or, the tests are, not really, they're biased, or they're just not really, covering what, the kids are learning. And so I think there's a lot of ways people can just sort of write it off and not be that concerned. And they feel like, oh, our kids are getting more successful. Isn't that good? So I just wondered if you all can sort of reflect on, is that the right way to think about it? And what's at stake here? Adam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues with grade inflation, one of the kind of debates that's been going on is, does it really, there's even an article about this from a few years ago that's called, like, Is the Sky Falling? And it's about grade inflation, and it's trying to be anti-alarmist and say it doesn't really matter that much that grades are going up, because the grade distribution is getting squashed, but it's still doing, like, cumulative GPA is still doing a good job of predicting the things that they cared about in that article.
And that's what they call that grade compression, don't they?
So grade inflation kind of automatically leads to compression, because you can't get a grade better than an A. So it can only go, if it's going up, it can only go up so much. So people have said that that's not really such a big deal. And that argument, and I would like to hear Mike's thoughts on this, because he's done some kind of updated work on this about whether this is still true. They were saying right then that it was still very predictive of later outcomes. But the problem with that for me is that is only looking at one constituency for grades, which is like college admissions people, education policy wonks who are like running regressions and looking at coefficients and stuff. But grades have other constituencies. They have, as Bailey was talking about, and I'm really glad that you were highlighting this, because I don't know if we were highlighting it as much. Families get this as a signal too, and if student learning depends on them being held accountable to do work, then the main mechanisms for that accountability are coming from parents, or coming from the schools directly in the form of things like grades, or coming from parents who are looking at grades to say, okay, you get an A and then you can take the car out this weekend, or whatever it is. But they're using those signals that are coming from grades. But if actually B students who are getting good grades aren't really necessarily excelling or learning what they're supposed to have learned, then we're misleading the students and their parents, and we can't expect that they're going to do their best.
Right, and then so what are some of the consequences of that? If we're misleading them, parents maybe have a different view of how their kids are doing. So, but what's missed then? Like, kids don't get extra help that they might need, and to come up, or what do you think?
I would say that when I think about the kids that we spent the most time with in our study, that for me, one of the things that's missed is they fundamentally believe that they are ready for college. That's what they aspire to, and they fundamentally believe that I'm getting all A's. I'm getting all A's in AP classes, and we have stayed in touch with some of the kids who we profiled in the report who have said essentially, at college now.
And not only are they not getting,
ready.
They're not passing the AP exams, but they get to college and they have to take remedial classes.
And then they have to take remedial courses. They have to pay for those remedial courses, and we could certainly go into the stats about how many of them actually end up with degrees. I would not say college is
burning through their Pell Grants and not being able to graduate.
But I think that the kids are suffering because they fundamentally believe the signals that we as grown-ups are sending them about how ready they are. And then
so Mike, what do you think? Like, what is at stake here? I mean, should we not be alarmist about this, or why are you concerned?
It's an excellent question. And so what I would say is this. What we find in our data consistently is that grades are very strong predictors of college success. But in combination with, things like standardized tests, that's when you can really sharpen your prediction about who will be successful at college. And so the question is, why are grades, even in the presence of grade inflation. So why are grades still so predictive? Grade inflation does not mean that everyone is getting A's, right? So you imagine in a school where there's a lot of grade inflation, and then you see a C student from that school. Well, that C high school grade point average is a very good indication that that student will not do well in college, right? So if you're getting lackluster grades, even in the presence of grade inflation, that is big red flag.
Is that really the case when, because one of the things I learned out of reading Measuring Success was this issue of test discrepant and GPA discrepant. So
Right.
like what that refers to is there's not consistency between your GPA and your score on the SAT or the ACT. And there are students who are C students, but they have a very good SAT score. So in that case, their test score discrepant. Their test scores are like unexpectedly high. I mean, how common is that?
So that was another chapter that I did not write. I will tell you, I don't think it is that common. I think everyone has a story. They know someone who did that. And of course, to be very clear, there are high schools with very rigorous grading, right? And in those high schools, that's when you'd find something like that. There are not a lot of students, period, who are graduating with C averages, right? But those who are, that's a red flag. Where I think things get a little tricky with grade inflation is this, as Adam talked about, you have a ceiling effect. I know we have weighting and so, but there's kind of like a maximum GPA, right? So if you think about students with A averages, there's a lot of kids with A averages, and there's a lot of variation in terms of the preparation that can be reflected with standardized tests. But if you're just looking at high school GPAs alone and you're talking about, who is ready to be successful in college or in their careers, at the A range, you have an enormous amount of variation.
Right. So again, I'm going to be devil's advocate here and say that, the whole idea of grade compression, and you can't really make the fine distinction between this A student and that A student, and the disappearance of, the vanishing valedictorian. I mean, isn't that the old way of thinking about education as a sorting mechanism? And, don't we now want to be more mastery based and have everyone reach high standards, not be all about, and just decouple seat time from proficiency, instead look at proficiency and give people as much time as they need to work at their own pace. I mean, there's a lot of trend toward, people feel that that's a better way to go. So maybe it doesn't really matter. Maybe everybody should be getting A's. It's just maybe one person can get an A in 2 months and the other person needs 3.5.
Yeah.
Well, there has to be some way of, if it takes me 5 years to figure out how to do, Algebra 1, maybe I shouldn't be getting the same grade as somebody who's putting in the time to learn that faster. So even if we do adopt a completely mastery-based model, I'm guessing grades probably won't go away. But I think as we move towards those things, I think we are going to have to rethink some of those questions. With the system we have, I think we have to make sure it's doing as good a job as it can. And things like end of course exams are content based, so they are based on a course segment. So they can be used in a kind of mastery model as well.
Yeah.
To your point, I think there is actually a movement growing to just get rid of grades entirely for that reason, right? And so there is now I think it's a consortium called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, which I now has.
Schools, right?
It's not only independent schools. I believe it's also there are public schools that are now joining that are just but they have a list on their website. But essentially, what this is there's a movement to say like, look, the way we think about high school transcripts now, and they actually talk about grade inflation on their website as one of the motivating factors. It's just student abilities can't be clearly articulated to the students and to the colleges effectively with this A through F scale. So it's a very much like a competency-based description of students. Now, I like that approach very much. I think I imagine that might be onerous for some teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a whole systemic change.
Yeah.
So we've seen in states, for example, Maine, they just tried to, go to a totally proficiency-based model, and they wound up repealing the state law that required that because it was so hard. You do have to commit as a whole system.
Well, and I would
But,
imagine actually some of the things we see that are causing grade inflation will still be, I would argue, problematic under that model, because there's a question of mastery of what, and if we don't actually all agree on this is the, and I don't know that we always have to anchor to standards, but if we don't all agree, like this is what you need to do to demonstrate Algebra 1, and we see this difference in, when I think about the differences we saw in assignments in Algebra 1, different Algebra 1 classes, like those, that will still mean different things, and I would imagine some children will still hear, you've mastered it, when in all actuality.
So one kind of big thread running through is the differential rate inflation, right? And the differences among kind of wealthier schools with maybe, lower percentages of kids from underrepresented minorities. And, so that's confusing to me. I think let's unpack that a little bit. Does it mean, because you were talking about, Bailey, that there's some very conflicting signals going to students of color, particularly, and there's differences. What do we think's behind that? What are the trends? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I can take that if you want. I think it has confused people a lot because you let off talking about static and dynamic and probably lost 90% of everybody at that point already. But grade inflation changes over time, and that's that dynamic thing when we anchor from a certain year, how much have things changed since that year. Yeah. And then we can also just think about the static grade inflation, like what Bailey was showing or what my first figure was showing, like what's the percentage of students who get Bs who fail the end of course exam. Yeah. And
it suggests there's grade inflation. It sort of suggests that there's a difference, and so probably those grades aren't very accurate.
Right. Yeah. And so the difference by socioeconomic status the research that's been done on that, and Mike has done some of this, so he can certainly chime in here, but that has looked at dynamic grade inflation. It's looked at the change in recent years to see like where are grades getting easier, conditional on where we started at the beginning of the study from 10 years ago. But
that's where you see the trend to they're going up faster at wealthier kind of schools with more white and Asian kids.
Right. Comparing grades to test scores and maybe other things like attendance and other things that would go into their grade, presumably, the grades are rising at the wealthier schools more quickly in recent years.
But it sounded like what you said, Bailey, is there's greater kind of a greater disconnect between the grades of kids of color in the districts you look like and their test scores than among white kids. So it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a dynamic change that kind of points to greater grade inflation in whiter, wealthier schools. But if you're just looking at the absolute kind of amount of grade inflation, it might be more affecting kids of color. So I don't know. Is that what's going on?
We think about static grade inflation as almost a grade guarantee. Like, what is a grade guarantee that you can do? And in our districts, at least for kids of color, a B just did not guarantee as much success on a state test or the AP exam as it did for a white kid.
So I think Fordham had a great blog that actually addressed this.
Mike.
I
wrote that blog.
But so we have the expert on the blog that talks about the differences, and they're really key. When I think about inflation, and I've certainly learned much more about sort of the lingua franca around this. Right. When I think about grade inflation, I think about trends over time. Right, which is very, very different than the excellent work that the TNTP report highlights, which is a snapshot. Different students, what are their grades versus their college readiness, and that isn't in both Seth's report and in my report. We did not tackle the static piece of that, but together, I think these three papers provide a very nice and consistent overview, it's just important to keep those different to keep in mind what we're talking about.
Yeah. So do any of the research that is informing our conversation, do you think it sheds light on the question of, is it generally easier or harder to get A's and B's in high poverty schools or low poverty schools? Do we know that from the research that's been done?
I think there have been some studies that have looked at this. I don't think it's been examined enough. I'd look for some more stuff on this in the future, hopefully. But what's been done, I think, and Bailey, you can chime in because maybe your report addresses this a little bit. But I think it shows that students who are in higher poverty schools are not being held to the same standards when it comes to grading, and so there's more of that static grade inflation in those schools, and there has been for a long time. And so if you wanted to put those two findings together, you could put it like maybe the rich kids are catching up a little bit in their grade inflation. If you wanted to put the static and dynamic pieces together, that might be a way to say it.
I think this comes back to a central issue that you brought up, which is, what is the point of grades? Is it to be used by college admissions officers to sort students? Or is it to really provide students with accurate and consistent signals about where they stand in terms of their preparation? And the reason, I think the dynamic and the differential grade inflation is important, it's because imagine you are a college admissions professional, and you need to figure out who to admit. You become familiar with the grading rubrics at given high schools. But the problem is at these affluent schools, the rubrics are changing. So like it's like the landscape is shifting more rapidly at these wealthier schools than at the less wealthy schools.
You mentioned in my home school district of Montgomery County, how they did away with final exams, and how that really led to a spike in the number of A's in math courses, partly because kids tended to do better in their regular coursework and worse on the kind of standardized final exam, which brought down their grade. And then once you stop doing that standardized final exam, they get better grades. Of course, my kid was exactly the opposite, would ace the final exam and never turn his homework in. So, but that's unusual. Mostly the kids do what they're supposed to do, and they might not really do well on the exam. So I wanted to bring that up because I wonder to what extent you guys think actual policies are a driver of grade inflation, or was this like a quirky thing, do you think, or do we just not know really the degree to which, policies like the one we just talked about versus kind of, teachers, the assignments they give, and and maybe students being, exceptional grade grubbers, and maybe parents putting pressure on and saying, come on, give them a break. What are the different factors here that could be do we know or do we not? Yeah.
Everything I've learned about this, we don't have any data that inform the why. None.
Yeah.
So everything, and Mike told me I wasn't supposed to do this, but reading the comments of the articles, and I think there have been some articles that have been written where you can see parents, people who claim to be parents and claim to be teachers, are chiming in on some of these mechanisms. And so there are a couple themes that emerge from the comments. Okay. That is, parents are exerting are exerting pressure, but there have some of the comments also have sort of implicated administrators as well. Have said that there is administrative pressure. I have a confession to make. This is confessional time. I taught at the college level. I taught meteorology. That was in my previous life when I taught meteorology. I studied meteorology before getting into this wonderful field, but I also taught more recently econometrics. And the most stressful times were when I had to figure out how to assign grades, because there is, for students, there was a lot of pressure, and I didn't want to feel like I was being the one to stop them from getting that internship, right? And so for students, I had students who, you know, quite frankly, I probably should have given them lower grades, but they would come and talk to me, and you know, you develop relationships with them and you root for them, and you know that they're. I know. I'm such a bleeding heart. You know that their grades do matter in terms of the opportunities, and so I succumbed to it. No, this is after I wrote the grade inflation chapter, and so I can only imagine that other people, other teachers are behaving similarly and are facing similar pressures, which I empathize with.
But from a systematic perspective, all of the incentives are for, I mean, you've got coaches, you've got parents,
Absolutely.
you've got students, you've got, sometimes administration wants to bump graduation rates. That might be good for them. So maybe bumping the grades up could help with that. All the pressures are on the teacher. And now the teacher, what reason do they have to keep the grade low? Like, who are they what pressure is there institutionally for them to hold the line? And unless you do things like kind of call out schools that are clearly handing out A's to everybody or whatever, and then maybe the administration that filters back through or something, there's just not much incentive for that teacher. I've done that myself, it's like you're the teacher, and there's no reason other than your own like stubbornness to hold the line.
And, it's interesting, at the same time, there's this pushback against standardized testing that we're seeing. So, there are all these pressures, just what you described, to push grades up. And we're also kind of in an era where there's this backlash against testing. And, some families, I mean, I don't say it's rampant, but in some places it is fairly common to, keep your kid out of the standardized testing. And so you don't even have that second check on how kids are doing. So, yeah. So, solutions to this. What do we think, how can we solve the problem? I guess I'll look to you, Bailey. Some of the issues of, you guys looked a lot at teacher expectations, right? So, is there a way to change teacher expectations? Talk to us a little bit about that, when the solutions you see to sort of the mismatch.
When we think about solutions to the mismatch, and when I think about, we shared individual district findings with the districts that participated in their leadership teams, and one of the things we heard consistently was, when we shared the grading disconnect, and one of the things we heard was, you told me, 10 slides ago in this presentation that my kids are mostly not working on grade level stuff. Right. And actually, a lot of our superintendents, as I think about how they're moving forward, they are first attempting to attack that, because we saw, as we talked to teachers and school administrators, there was not a deep understanding of what grade level content looked like, and teachers were good faith grading what kids were working on. Kids were doing well. They were giving them A's because they earned them on the content that was put in front of them. And
but they thought that they had a very good grasp of the state
Absolutely.
Standards,
So
right? They thought they did.
When we surveyed teachers and asked, how well do you know your state standards, upwards of 90% said very well. But on the same survey, when we asked them a set of questions to get out, is this third grade math or fourth grade math or fifth grade math, if you're an elementary school math teacher, they did not know the content as well as they thought they did. So I do think there's something around knowledge building systemically about what the bar is for particular.
And then maybe how to give students assignments that reach that, right? Yeah. Because there's also that sort of issue of standards, but not really translating those high level standards to materials and assignments and actual instruction at the classroom level.
Well, this is not a victimless crime. I mean, giving easy A's and having low standards for students, that they are not going to learn as much. They are not going to work as hard. There's research on this at a college level. Students who are in classes where they expect to get an A work a lot less. It's common sense, but it's also found in the research. There's also research about how much students learn in elementary school. David Figlio has a study from about 10 years ago in Education Next that talks about tough graders getting more out of their students. Students were learning more when they had teachers who were the ones who were holding the line.
Some teachers feel like, well, my kid, like you're a sixth grade teacher, right? And my kid is doing math at a third grade level, so it's setting them up to fail to give them sixth grade work. I think they think that. Do you think, Bailey, from your study, do you see that is a valid concern or not?
When I think about I certainly think that's a concern that we heard from teachers in our study and focus groups and in interviews. When I think about what we saw in our assignment data specifically, though, we can look only at assignments that gave kids a chance to meet the demands of grade level standards. I can throw out all the ones that didn't give kids a shot, and what we saw is that more often than not, kids actually were successful when we gave them a shot. And there's this fear on the behalf of grown-ups, if I have to protect you from this hard thing that I'm not sure you're going to be able to do. And what we saw in our data and also what we heard from kids is like, let me try. And like, yes, help me if I'm struggling. I would not say to a teacher who's teaching sixth grade math to a class of kids who do math on average like third graders, give them sixth grade level math and let them suffer only. Like, yes, you need to work to fill in gaps in kids' prior knowledge and skill, but if you are doing math like a third grader and I only give you third grade math, we're never gonna catch you up. Which I think is what we saw pretty consistently when we looked at results.
So that's one solution, is expecting more.
This is about your report, which I want to add, because I want to make sure that I haven't gotten this statistic correct. But I think what you found that was, and this goes to your comment, I think what you found that was so startling to me is that students of color and white students, when given grade level assignments, performed exactly the same, or close, pretty close to the same.
But it was not huge.
But there was a big gap in terms of the frequency of getting assigned grade level assignments. So I think we need to ask ourselves, like, why are certain students, so far behind in grade level? And is this an accumulation of just not being sort of given the opportunity to perform at grade level?
Exactly. Yeah. So I also want to invite folks from the audience maybe to ask any questions. So, yeah. Great. Okay.
David Parker, Learning Heroes, and just curious.
We should have you up here.
Yeah, I was going to cite your report. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I just wanted to get back to the conversation about incentives that you brought up, because I think a lot of teachers know that report card grades are subjective. They would say themselves that, no, these don't necessarily mean that this child is proficient. This child is performing at grade level. It's that they came to class on time and they've handed in their assignments. And to your point, Adam, I think, there's a rapport between the student and the teacher, and the teacher's rooting for the student. So what can we do if teachers are afraid that parents are going to get upset if they are more realistic about their grades? They're potentially going to face administration being upset with them. So what is the solution here? What's an incentive for a teacher? I just wanted to get back to that, because I'd love to hear more, about what your thoughts are there.
Well, I think it's hard. I think that, inflation, when we try to deal in the economy with inflation, I don't always like the analogy because they're a little different, but we never are like, oh, we had inflation for 10 years, so let's try to bring the dollars back to where they were 10 years ago. That's not viable, because people's expectations have changed, and now we have a different view of what each of these units means, and a B means something different now. And so I think it's tough. I think holding the line is something we can do by, hoping that, or having states and districts actually create some incentives for them not to hold the line, rather than all the incentives being towards higher graduation rates and things that aren't really externally validated. So I think having like external validation, and that can come in the form of stuff like EOCs. It can also come from other kinds of auditing that the states can do to see if grades are getting out of whack. It can also, tying grades to standards, more closely can be part of it. But that's part of it. I think it's also possible that we may need to have some other changes to grades where we, maybe we have a triple A and a double A, or and something like that, or maybe we need to.
plus.
A lot of colleges are now going to plus and minus grading, and I don't know if Mike, do you know, is this partly a reaction to grade compression? But it's more prevalent now than it used to be. I'm curious if that's another institutional solution that we might be able to use.
I don't know about the college level. I do think a lot of high schools do have that plus and minus system in their grading. And I don't know how that's changed over time.
I'm reminded of, I recently read the book that Arnie Duncan, the former education secretary, wrote, and his whole theme was, education's built on lies. And part of it being the lies that we tell about how well our students are doing. He got into a lot of trouble at different times for saying those things, like pretty bluntly. But, that part of it was the kind of what parents want to hear and what educators want to tell parents about how their kids are doing. And
I just spoke to a parent, I'll stop in a second, but I just spoke to a parent earlier today who was talking about, she knows that her child is not at grade level, and her child's trying to kind of get out of this one class, this extra math class that she has. And she's struggling with, how do I talk to my child about this? And she's one of the parents who actually realizes that her child isn't performing at grade level, unlike most parents who don't know. So that's another part of the story.
yeah, support.
Hi, my name is Mike Williams. I'm the founder of a pre-Coursera MOOC that goes K through graduate school. And talking about grade inflation at the higher grades, higher ed, and then at lower grades, if the grades are getting inflated in college and they're getting inflated in high school, then the teachers that are graduating from ed move right back into the education, and you got this spiral that goes downward because, hey, I didn't do that much work in college, so you don't have to do that much work in your class. And so kids are all across the whole spectrum are reading less, doing less, and doing less homework along all areas. And I think that part of the problem with the high schools is that are giving less rigorous work and getting higher grades is there's an uneven playing field to get into college. So the question I have is,
a question, yeah.
Yeah, the question is, what kind of fixes do you recommend regarding that whole circular downward? Mike?
So I do have to say that hypothesis that you laid out, if I were a betting man, I would bet that is at least part of it. We don't have any evidence, and I think now is the time where we actually have to, and this involves, I think, very good qualitative research. Much of what particularly what's, in the Fordham report and my report, it was very quantitative. I think we really, in order to drill down into the mechanisms, I think we need a lot more qualitative research to understand the pressures that teachers face, administrators face, and whether impressions of grades, if you look at sort of more seasoned teachers, do teachers who are older, are they more rigid, right? Does a B mean something different to them than some of the newer teachers? In terms of solutions, there have been solutions at the higher ed that have been tried. There's one university, a very well-known one, that had a forced grade distribution for several years, and that did not last, right? It was Princeton. So, and that was an experiment, and I believe it has been discontinued because if you're forcing a grade distribution, grades are important for employers and graduate schools. If you're forcing a grade distribution, and your peers are just kind of not doing that, then you're at a competitive disadvantage. And you can imagine that, you know, the same thing could happen in schools. I don't think this would be a smart move, but you can imagine like teachers like having a forced distribution of grades. But then that is only for sorting mechanisms, right? To your point, if it's, you know, if everybody has mastered the material, then why shouldn't everybody get A's?
Yeah,
So
the forced grade distribution thing has a lot of other bad side effects,
Yeah.
like creating some perverse kind of competitive pressures. It really has to be about external standards, I think, and holding people to something that's external to students. That way, everybody could get an A and everybody could fail instead of having an artificially or just organic forced distribution, which I think is what you're talking about.
Some schools like that do maintain high, like tough grading policies. Sometimes they can have a good enough kind of reputation in the field if you're a, say, fancy, elite, independent prep school that holds the line and is tough and is known for that. That's one thing. But most places, and so the competitive disadvantage that their kids might otherwise suffer is mitigated somewhat by the relationships. But for most places, it's not that case at all. And, you don't want your own kids, whether you're at the K-12 level, at the high school level, or the college level, to suffer consequences from you holding standards that are very different from what others do.
We've heard that from teachers in focus groups. I think about CNSP has a prize we call the Fishman Prize, where we look for the best teachers in the country. And I heard from one of our teachers when I presented this research to him. He was like, "Look, I am teaching in a peanut field in North Carolina. I know my kids aren't perfectly on grade level. We're working on it, but like, I want them to get into UNC, and the kids in Chapel Hill are getting A's. And so, like, am I going to give all my kids C's and D's when I know for a fact that's going to screw them getting into an elite university in our state? No. And so I feel like teachers certainly feel that pressure, particularly when I think about, teachers in low income schools who are trying to prepare their kids to compete with kids. We heard over and over from lots of different teachers, like, I can't be the one to hold the line, because
to be
the
an ogre.
implications it'll have for my kids and their life opportunities.
Yeah. So, next question.
My name is Emily Langhorn, and I am a policy analyst and a former high school teacher, one who wrote one of those "I was complicit in grade inflation" articles. And I guess I'm hearing a lot of, I don't want to call it teacher blaming, but it does seem like a lot of this burden is falling on teachers. And in my experience, you couldn't give a kid a bad grade because administration came down on you. You certainly couldn't fail a child, not promote them to the next grade. You actually got penalized if you were the teacher who had the most failures, because it made you a bad teacher. And teachers found themselves in a tough position because they could not give students grades that reflected their ability, but then they were held accountable for how students did on standardized tests, even though students are not held accountable in most states for how they do on standardized tests. So the question is, first, I'm interested in why there isn't more qualitative research about teacher voice. And secondly, in your solution, there doesn't seem to be a lot of pressure being put on districts and administrators to kind of clean up their act. So why is that?
I'll just make a quick. You guys might.
It's a tough question.
While you're thinking about it, it's interesting that you raised the issue of, in some instances, there aren't consequences for the students on certain standardized tests, right? So you could hypothesize that maybe that's a contributing factor in the mismatch between grades and test scores. If the kids are not motivated to take the particular standardized test. And of course, sometimes they're like the end of course exams in North Carolina that the Fordham study looked at, they are factored in to the grades. So people, the kids did have an incentive to take them seriously. But that is, something, a big point of contention, right, between teachers and often policymakers who, are in favor of the standardized tests and holding schools accountable for those results. Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Emily's point that we've made it very hard on teachers.
Yeah.
And that was what I was kind of trying to say when I was saying that you have pressure coming from every angle to lower the bar or raise the grade, and not much reason not to do it. And so, no, I don't think that, I think making teachers be the coach and the referee is just, you're putting them in a difficult position. And so, one of the things more broadly that I think we could think about is just separating teaching and assessment more, and using external assessments, and they don't just have to be standardized tests. They can be standardized tests, and they can also be assessments from other teachers, or Skype in assessments from across the country, teachers in other, in other parts of the country. Or you could do this in a lot of different ways, where you could separate teaching and assessment so that that you're teaching, here's what we need to learn, but you're the coach rather than having to be both the coach and the referee. So I think that there's definitely, putting this all on teachers is definitely been part of the problem.
I also think, and I'm very sympathetic to that, and I totally agree. And I think what we really need is we need to understand the mechanisms and the forces that are going on through qualitative research. But I think as we approach that, it's very important that we sort of assume good intentions, right? And we never talk about blame, because we need honesty, and we need to have these honest sort of conversations in which everybody is really everybody wants the best, right? And so we have to assume that. And oh, here comes the alcohol. And so I think drilling down into what's going on at the school level, I think that's really like where we are now. We're at a critical juncture where we need this qualitative research. And I think we need to be really smart about how we're collecting the information.
That would be fascinating. Who's volunteering for that? A question? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
All right.
Hannah Allen, former teacher and former research analyst with 50CAN. I would love to know, just thinking forward and more progressively, that we're starting to see the influx and creation of these alternative teacher certification programs, also alternative district certification programs and principal certification programs. Is there a place for these discussions and reform efforts within those areas? And is that happening? And could you speak to that?
Are you thinking like teacher residencies, the move there?
Residencies,
right.
Alternative programs.
I'm not sure about that, but I don't think that it's because teachers haven't been trained enough. I really think it's more of a kind of systematic incentives problem, that they don't have a lot of reason to hold the line, and so there's a lot of pressure on them to lower the bar or to raise the grade. And it's not because they don't know, it's more like they don't have much of an incentive to go according to some, there isn't, it's debatable what those standards should be. So having the teachers be the gatekeeper of the standards, the single gatekeeper of the standards, is just it's like an institutional problem. That's how I see it anyway.
Well, it seems like we're training a new wave of administrators. Could this be an
Yes.
opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to do it more?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think about, I went through an alternative certification program. I don't think we ever talked about grades. When I think about my husband went through a superintendent residency, chief academic officer residency. That was not a topic. It was almost assumed that that's a thing you'll figure out how to do, at least when I was.
And my understanding, and the teachers in the room, please correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I've heard too, is traditional teacher prep programs, there's very little instruction on assessment. You just kind of assume when you go to school, the teacher knows how to grade, but they're not often really taught grading particularly, so I'm not sure it's a big focus in the alternative or the traditional, to be honest. Yeah.
So Mike Petrilli from here at Fordham. So can we talk about this from an elementary school perspective? Because there the dynamics are very different. We're not talking about kids worried about getting into college. it really is about the messages to parents and the signal about, is your child on track or not? I am thinking about it because I went to my 8-year-old's parent-child conference this morning. So,
Did you ask if your child was ungrateful?
yeah, and I'm like, what is up with all these A's? Is this really my child? Look. So here's the concern. I mean, we know there's a bunch of kids who, based on the state test, but also the diagnostic tests, are way below grade level and not doing well. And you'd assume that the teachers in the schools know that, and yet the report cards are going out with very high glowing grades in elementary school. So, I mean, what are some solutions that we can offer? Like, is it, for example, that they really need to differentiate performance and mastery from effort, or some kind of clear statement that says, we are worried about your child, or, your child who got B's, but you need to know that that is the lowest grade that anybody in the class got. Or is this just a problem? The schools are never going to do this because it implies that they have to do something to fix the problem. And the reason the kid's doing 2 grade levels below is that they passed the kid along, even though they weren't prepared for the next grade. So what are some possible solutions here?
We're going to talk about
In 30 seconds or less. Come on. Hey, grab a beer. Mike, do you want a beer? I'll get you a beer.
I'll get a wine. No.
I'll get you one. Who else needs one?
Well, Mike, you're bringing up your parental experience. I'll bring up mine. I've got 3 kids. You only have 2, right? So there we go. But, my kids' school at different times have separated grades and effort. And I just think that was as subjective as anything. I was stunned. My youngest child just graduated from high school last year, so he's a college freshman, and I was totally blown away. And the school recognizes both, academic honors. So you have high honors academic, and regular honors academic, and you have high honors effort and regular honors effort. There were no boys who got high effort grades. No boys.
I'll drink that later if no one else wants it. Don't worry, it won't go.
Sorry, all of you at home.
But it seemed crazy that boys could get high academic honors. There were plenty of them up there. My son's up there. But no boys on high effort. Now, what was that based on?
Turning in their homework.
Well, but they were maybe it's the boys act like they don't try. Because how are they getting the high academic effort, grades if they're not trying at all? So I just, I don't know about that either. Is that such a great solution? But, yeah. Anybody else has anything on that? Or,
propose one of those, not propose, but just put out there and just get a reaction to it. So what about report card grades with your state test scores on the report card? Yep. Would that be helpful, or would that be more confusing and polarizing?
As a parent, I remember getting the, state reports, whenever they came in, late in the summer, long after the grades came in, and it did seem like something disconnected from the grades. So I think that's a promising idea. At least, do you think, it sort of speaks to your study a lot, right? I think it would show people, the school has to be really ready to deal with it, though.
I do think there's an interesting.
There'd be a lot of blowback, potentially.
When I think about the recommendations from the Fordham paper, one of the recommendations was treat these things as complementary because they actually do measure different things. And I'm going to turn back to a study you guys did with, I believe it was K to 8 parents, but you correct me when I get it wrong. We heard that parents, and I think you guys cited it in your paper, parents trust grades more than they trust state tests. And I do think there is something interesting around, how do we talk about both of these things at the same time? And how do we equip teachers and school leaders both with actually the tools and the mechanisms? When I think about even just stuff as simple as I think about the report card system I use that I had to enter grades in, the gargantuan effort it would have taken to make it have state test data on it. wouldn't have been able to do it in my probably. But if there were systems that enabled that, if state test data came out sometime before November of the next school year, et cetera, and we could actually support parents and families as like there's a more holistic perspective about your child here, and let's dig into that and talk about like what I, as the person who's leading your child, needs to do to support your child to be successful. I think that's a really interesting idea. We also toyed with a couple of districts in our study as they thought about moving forward. Essentially, like you could, and you would be taking something on here, but you could actually in your district, if you wanted to, publish a like, here's a level of grade guarantee in our schools. And we had a couple of superintendents who I think are still toying with the.
And so grade guarantee, you mean
the idea
by
of
that?
like static. Here's like, and it's almost
Here.
it's a little bit of a play on what you said, but like here, a kid who gets a B in this class.
As
Last year, the kids who got B in this class, 10% of them were on grade level.
Right.
Like saying that publicly.
I think there could be some way forward with kind of report card reform and making sure that report cards are really communicating information in the most effective way that they could. And I think all these are good ideas, and maybe printing something like, what's the average GPA in this school? What's the average likelihood of, success on X, Y, or Z in this school? Having that information to contextualize the grades could be valuable, but I'd like to see some more research on it.
I seem to recall, so my high school transcript had my AP scores and SAT scores on them. And I was told that is extremely unusual. I thought that was typical. I thought that's how transcripts were structured.
That is
But
unusual.
yeah,
Can we all appreciate that you remember your high school?
I do. Well, I remember because I remember what was sent to my colleges, and it was on what was sent to colleges as well. So I thought that, I assumed that was standard. It's not.
Is anybody aware of anywhere that does what you're talking about? Puts out the, report cards with the standardized test scores? Anybody? No.
This was a very long time ago.
No,
To be
but I'm
clear.
saying for the report cards,
Oh.
yeah. For transcript, it's kind of that's the end. But
Yeah.
I would also though love when I think about that to see, we're talking a lot about report cards and their signaling power, but I also know like I work at an education nonprofit with other people who work at education nonprofits, and occasionally we'll get on the phone with my colleagues to be like, you understand assessment data. Can you show me what this like
this report you got as a
my
parent.
kids on grade
Student
level.
growth
So when I think
percentile
about
means or
like,
something,
what
yeah.
we ask parents to make sense of, I would love to see Learning Heroes continue. I think you guys are doing some work on that, but continuing to do that work
But you're
because
absolutely right. I mean, it's just like the communication
there's a hieroglyphic
component
aspect
is so
of it.
important and can be, especially with more data. Try to put on it.
Are there other comments or questions? Right here.
Hi, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a mathematician at Johns Hopkins University, and I've done a lot of work for Fordham with math standards. And I guess one of the things I'd like to see, and you addressed it briefly there, is on high school transcripts, have a GPA distribution on every student's transcript. And you can do this in the fourth grade too. You can say, in this class, we got 20 students got A's and 10 got B's. That gives feedback to parents that maybe they wouldn't expect if they didn't understand that.
That's kind of like the class rank, though, idea, right? You're just saying class rank in each course, right?
Well, I would say for maybe this class, the average grades were just give a distribution of grades, a GPA.
Like a histogram of grades. Yeah.
This is why I think we need more research, is because that makes sense to me too. Like have a histogram of whatever. But then I realized that like what percentage of parents would understand the histogram.
Yeah.
So I think we need to have we need to look at some different report card formats and see what is information overload and what is the right amount and what is not enough.
Colleges would understand it on a transcript.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
That just reminds me, do you guys really have a sense of why we have the disappearance of the class rank? Do you know what's leading to that?
I have a conjecture.
Okay.
Here's my conjecture. Historically, the fraction of what's entered into a rankings magazine that we all know is fraction of students in the top decile of their courses. So there are pressures on colleges to have that number as high as possible. And so if you're a very competitive high school and you have many, many, many high achieving students, it really does kind of work to your disadvantage to rank them, because you could have very high achieving students who are not in the top decile. And
I think exactly the same thing. I said that before. I think there's a disincentive for the high schools and there's a disincentive for the colleges.
Right.
Really to do it. But
It might lead to some kind of unhealthy competition. I mean, to have that. I mean, it's relative grading. It's not like we could all be successful or we could all fail. Let's work together. It really, I think it could create some kind of perverse incentives.
We've talked about pressure on teachers, but what about pressure on school counselors? Right? There are pressures on school counselors that we know to get students into certain types of colleges. And elite colleges, very selective colleges, are just becoming more selective by the year. So the likelihood that any one applicant will get in is getting lower and lower and lower. And so, it's like all hands on deck. Everybody needs to help them get in.
But what you suggested about just contextualizing the information a little bit, it's not necessarily ranking, it's sort of showing where your kid falls. If your kid was one of 5 kids who got a B versus, 25 kids, that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other thoughts or?
My name is Jing Hong. I'm from National School Boards Association. I'm the research analyst there. My question is, you said that not every school inflated grades. So for those schools that didn't inflate grades, how did they maintain that? Is it because they do the report really stick to formative assessment or accumulate the GPA? So how did you explore the data that way?
Without going into the schools and looking exactly this is why we need more qualitative research. Without going into the schools, we can't get any sense from the quantitative data. We really don't know the mechanisms.
Spoken like a true researcher, more research is needed.
More research is needed. It's a great question.
Right.
Well, the second question is there any variation across subjects, like you did algebra? Is it social studies or English language arts? Are they which subject is more inflated?
Good question.
I don't know. I think there's a report that I mentioned. It's the high school transcript study report, which is by a U.S. Department of Education report, and they actually break out GPAs by subject area, and so unfortunately, I pulled a few figures that I thought people would find interesting. That wasn't one of them, but I can point you to the report.
Studying that science, like math and
Right.
so social science, business, and this. Wondering for high school or K-12, is there any subjects that inflated more than the other subjects?
I think I don't know that we know that, but I certainly would agree as the mother of an engineering major that it's hard to get great grades.
Yeah.
Yeah. Seems like it's less grade inflation. Yeah, in the hard sciences. Well, I think that's about it for today, and we have some refreshments over here. Thank you very much. Join me in thanking our panelists. I think you did a great job.